Well, it's great to see you all. Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you all for coming out while it's still warm before we have whatever horrendous freezing temperatures ahead of us. I hope you all had a great break. And some of you may recognize Richard before. He is not just one of my favorite speakers. I know oftentimes one of y'all's favorite speakers. One of these incredible people who can speak just as well and interestingly on China, on Russia, on the Middle East. I might throw in a Guyana question to throw you off. But Richard's also been a great friend of the council for a very long time. He's also very kindly been one of the people who's connected me probably with some of these big name speakers that we've hosted. You may never realize that connection actually originally came from Richard. So I want to say thank you. And I would also say to all of you who are interested in foreign policy, defense policy, the think tank that he leads, the Center for New American Security, not just is it a truly bipartisan organization with great people from both the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans, leaders from intelligence, military, and diplomatic positions. To me, it's the most effective and most efficient and kind of innovative think tank on American defense and security policy there is. So I recommend you guys don't just check out what Richard writes, but what all of his experts write. And we will discuss kind of where we are today, this idea of countries, whether they like or not, maybe having to choose with regards to will they kind of align themselves more with Russia, with China, align themselves more with the United States, but maybe just to kind of set the stage and kind of get people an idea of where we are and where we've come from. Could you maybe discuss how it is over these last 30, 40, 50 years, really since Nixon and Kissinger kind of opened up China for the United States, how it is that the United States ideas and ambitions of expanding and opening the Chinese economy would grow a middle class, and that eventually would lead to more, if not democracy, but leads to kind of a softening of the Communist Party, or at least some degrees of more kind of openness in regards to political representation. Can you talk about where and how that may have succeeded, and where and how and why maybe it failed?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be back. If you go all the way back to Nixon and Kissinger and the opening to China, the thing that really drove the U.S.-China relationship was a common enemy in the Soviet Union. And that was the glue that held the U.S. and China together. There certainly weren't other sort of shared values and other kinds of things, but they did have this shared interest. Fast forward to 1991, the Soviet Union goes away, and China is still kind of emerging as a major power economically, militarily, diplomatically, and so forth. And the United States, over time, has to kind of figure out what it wants to do with China. In 1989, there had been the Tiananmen Square massacre. There's a big focus on human rights in China and so forth. And so the policy that the U.S. adopted, really in the Clinton administration, that continued all the way through to some degree into the beginning of the Trump administration, was an engagement policy. And it was a policy that was premised on bringing China into the international system, in the World Trade Organization, constructing a very elaborate and high-scale economic relationship, lots of intense diplomatic coordination and collaboration, things like that. And part of the underlying hope with all of this was that through the flow of ideas and as a new middle class started to grow in China, agitate for its rights and all these other things, that it would lead to the sort of liberalization of China, that human rights would improve, there would be an improved rule of law, maybe there would even be some form of democratization down the line. And at a minimum, it would become more of a responsible stakeholder was a term, but kind of invested in the international system as it is. And that didn't work. If you look at China today under Xi Jinping, it is more repressive than it was under Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao. It is more assertive internationally. It has a more crystallized vision for elements of the current international order that it wants to change, and so forth. And so at the same time, there was this kind of engagement strategy. There was also hedging going on the U.S. side. Well, if China doesn't turn out the way we want, if our policy doesn't transform China, what do? Well, we build up these relations with all these other countries in Asia to sort of balance China. So Japan, South Korea, Australia, Vietnam, India, and so forth. So all that was happening over time. The engagement started to kind of get less and less, and the hedging got more and more until during the Trump administration, now into the Biden administration, the hedging or the balancing really is the policy. And I don't think anyone really believes anymore that the U.S. Has or can transform China through a set of policy measures.
And just maybe two questions before we kind of move up to where we are today. And don't want to play kind of Monday morning quarterback, but you mentioned 1991, the fall of Soviet Union, 1989, Tiananmen Square. That's a true turning point, potential turning point in Chinese history. Maybe not. Some people would argue. From what you know, because you know a lot of the individuals who are involved, the Bush administration, only in office for a few months. 1989, a few months later, Tiananmen Square protests break out. They also are dealing with knowing what is happening in Eastern Europe, the Solidarity movement. Things look like they're collapsing maybe in Eastern Europe. Was the Bush administration, I suppose, short-sighted or maybe too preoccupied? Because also not much later, a few weeks later, Saddam will invade Kuwait, and they knew he'd been rambling about that as well, to basically only give China a slap on the wrist for its brutal repression of Tiananmen Square. And maybe if the United States had been more forceful in its response, could the Chinese, have a different direction, or is that just the inherent nature of the Communist Party, that it wouldn't have mattered what the United States tried to do, they were going to adhere to their policies, to their ideology, and do their own thing either way?
So we get to counterfactual history on the second question.
Yes.
So, okay. The best thing about counterfactual history is there's no wrong answer.
And no right answer. Yeah.
No, there's no wrong answer. I can't tell you that's right, so I'm someone who believes ardently that human rights and democracy promotion needs to be an integral part of U.S. foreign policy. But when I look back at the Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration's reaction to Tiananmen Square, I think they probably got it about right, which might seem a little surprising if you know anything about it, because they did sanction the Chinese, but President Bush sent his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, on a secret trip, basically to meet with the Chinese leader and to say, we want to preserve the relationship, essentially, and Deng Xiaoping. And I think part of the reason I think that is because that happened in 1989, and we know what happened in 1991. The Soviet Union disintegrated, and suddenly we're all, as we remain to this day, very focused on China and all the other non-Soviet things. But they didn't know how the Cold War was going to end. They didn't know if the Cold War was going to end. And China was a major sort of partner of the United States in what was the big kind of existential competition and geopolitical challenge at the time. So I think that they were wise to try to not have Tiananmen completely destroy the bilateral relationship, but at the same time, they couldn't do nothing, and they did sanction them. I think there's another question. I mean, frankly, I think that no matter what the United States had done in the aftermath of Tiananmen, it probably wasn't going to change the direction of China very much one way or the other. I think one of the lessons over the past 30 years is how little influence the United States actually has over events inside China. I mean, we've told ourselves a story over a long period of time that through our own policy choices, we can sort of push China in this direction or that direction or whatever, and it turns out they actually make a lot of their own decisions.
And to get it to more recent times, and it's probably good advice with regards to the Middle East and much of the world, we probably have less influence upon key nations than we might realize.
I wouldn't say that as a general statement. I think a lot of it depends on what country you're talking about, what the context is, what the levers of influence are, what kind of forces, political or otherwise, you have domestically inside a particular country. I mean, there's plenty of times where the United States has played a very significant, if not decisive, role in the domestic politics of another country. I just don't think that China in 1989 was going to be on the list of those countries that would fall into that category. And
obviously, you worked for many years very closely, a very close associate of Senator John McCain, I think a hero for a lot of the country and someone well respected on both sides of the aisle. Probably no bigger champion of human rights in the American political sphere in the last 2 or 3 decades. Do you think, you mentioned that we probably had less influence on China than we realized. that where we are now today with regards to human rights abuses, whether it be with the Uyghurs, whether it be with what's happening in Hong Kong, where it happens with the massive surveillance, that there's little or nothing the U.S. can do to impact China's policies towards kind of increased repression and human rights abuses, or is there something the U.S. could be doing or should be doing?
I think, on the margins, but not fundamentally. The United States has put in sanctions and taken other coercive steps in response to the Chinese repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and the repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang continues, and the camps are filled with people who should not be detained but who are. And of course there were from the beginning there were sort of two different theories for how you improve the human rights situation in China. One was you sanction and cajole and try to punish bad behavior so as to incentivize better behavior by the government. The other is, no, you trade and try to open the country to the greatest degree possible to information flows, and then you create a sort of constituency that agitates for its own human rights and things like that. And neither of those models seems to have accomplished much when it comes to China in particular. So I don't think that in the face of outrages like what is happening in Xinjiang, the United States should do nothing, because I think even if the something is ineffective on the ground in changing the situation, there's often value in taking a stand. But I think we have to be relatively modest unless we're going to, invade the country and do something militarily, which we obviously will not do, that, our leverage will be limited.
And then we always, I think, are thinking about how the United States views other countries, but probably more importantly, how they view us. Do you agree or disagree with the supposition that since these last 40, 50 years, while the United States might have looked at China as a useful partner to balance Russia, someone to help us find a way out of Vietnam, and eventually maybe be viewed as an economic competitor, that all this time China was long-term going to view the United States as a definite competitor, a potential adversary. The famous quote, whether it's how much to attribute to it or not, in terms of the actual intent of Deng Xiaoping in the 80s is, hide your strength and bide your time. Has China always had this view of the United States as a serious competitor that it knew it would have to engage with and potentially be prepared to, basically, God forbid, actually even be a conflict with down the line? Or is that something that has gotten more dire and more extreme in the last, especially years since President Xi's been in power?
It definitely is the latter. There are some people that say that China's had a 100-year plan to displace the United States. It's been pursuing quietly for years and years and years, and we just didn't know about it. And there's these sort of cliches that China thinks in centuries and Americans can only think in quarterly profit cycles or maybe in 2-year election cycles or something like that. And there's somewhere deep in the bowels of some building in Beijing the secret plan, and they just execute against that plan that they developed so long ago. It just doesn't seem that way to me. They try a lot of stuff, and some of it works and some of it doesn't, and some of the stuff that doesn't work they stop, and some of the stuff that doesn't work they still do, which is ultimately good for us. But they're kind of as daft as us when it comes to these kinds of things. But of course, I think they do have some instincts. So for example, after 1991, and the Chinese military saw how easily the United States ran over the Iraqi military, they concluded, they said as much in their own journals and everything, oh my gosh, well, we've got to modernize our military, because if we ever got in a war, we would get run over like that too. And that was an impetus for them to try to reform their military. I think a real turning point came with in a relatively short period of time, the ascension of Xi Jinping to power and the global financial crisis. You can see that Xi concluded, and I think others in the Chinese leadership concluded as well, that the global financial crisis was sort of basic evidence that the West day was done. The United States in particular was sort of a declining power. It was going to cling to the prerogatives and the privileges it had when it was the most powerful country in the world. But China's time, which Deng Xiaoping had always said, we're going to bide our time, we're still growing. Well, that time had come. and the world was going to have to get used to China have a much more dominant role, especially in Asia, but also in other parts of the world, and that was natural. And so I think that sort of core belief is driving a lot of where Xi and the Chinese leadership are coming from right now.
And to get to the title of the event this evening, and a good article, I recommend any of you all want to read it. You mentioned that in the last year or so, both Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, have publicly said, and others in the administration said too, we are not asking countries to choose between the United States and China. We're not forcing you to make a decision. But you argue, especially in certain key areas, it's gotten to the point where decisions will have to be made, or the U.S. is even indirectly forcing you to do so. Can you maybe give some the clearest and maybe most important examples, say especially with regards to diplomatic and military-related issues, technology-related issues, of maybe how this gradual forced choice is being forced by both Beijing and D.C.?
Yeah, so this is a little article that I wrote in Foreign Affairs last year, and the impetus for it was I was traveling a bunch internationally, and if you go to Southeast Asia, the mantra that you hear from so many countries is we don't want to be forced to choose between the United States and China. Quite understandably, they want a mix of benefits, both security and economic, from both. They don't want to have to select, one or the other, right? And then you start to hear this from other countries. You even hear it in Europe, less so now than maybe a year or two ago, but nevertheless, you hear this in Europe, and you hear this from a number of countries around the world. And so when they say, our big worry is that we're going to be forced to choose between the United States and China, and our big desire is to not, the U.S. government has been saying, well, don't worry about it, you don't have to. But of course, you do have to. It is true that neither the United States nor China are going to force countries into a big, overarching, strategic, us versus them, all-in kind of relationship, the way that they were more or less like that during the Cold War, because during the Cold War you had these integrated political, military, economic blocs. So you had the West, you had the East. There were some exceptions to that, but that was basically it. So think about the United States and the Soviet Union. We sold some Pepsi and some wheat to the Soviet Union, and that was kind of it, and they didn't really have much we wanted. And so there just really wasn't much economic relationship. The Allies pretty much sort of traded with each other and so forth. Well, it's completely different now, right? One of America's own largest trade partners is China, which we say is our number one, strategic challenge simultaneously. So we're not saying, all these countries cut off your economic relationship with China, or China's not saying cut it off with the United States, or whatever. But on specific issues, they're being forced to choose already. So take, for example, Huawei is the Chinese telecom provider that wanted to build out the 5G network everywhere it could, and it's the lowest cost and everything else. So you take a country like Germany, which a few years ago was thinking about letting Huawei build out its 5G network. Well, the Americans went over and said, if you do that, don't do it. And if you do, we are likely to cut off intelligence sharing with you. And then the Chinese came over and said, if you don't, then we're going to retaliate against your businesses. Last time I checked, that's what it means to not be to be forced to choose. Or China wants to build military installations, military bases around the world. It's got one in Djibouti, it's got an installation in Cambodia, but it's been looking at places like UAE, Equatorial Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomons, other places like that. And so China comes in and says, let's start to get in a relationship that might lead one day to some sort of military facility. And America says, no, whatever you do, do not let the Chinese get on the path to a military facility. And they both trot out their carrots and their sticks in order to do that and try to force the right response from their point of view. Or on semiconductors is another example. The United States in fall of 2022 issued export controls on high-end semiconductors used for particular purposes in China. Well, the machines that those things are made on are made in the Netherlands, and some variants of them are made in Japan. And so, America said, well, these only apply to American semiconductors, and then immediately got on the plane to the Netherlands and to Japan and said, you got to join us with this. And of course, the Chinese said, no, this is crazy, don't do this. And they did come our way. Mm-hmm. But this is the beginning of what is happening, and it's going to happen over and over and over. And it's going to touch more and more issues as this long-term competition between the U.S. and China really continues to heat up.
you touched upon chips, specifically the most expensive and most capable chips that are vital for especially most advanced military weapon systems, for communication systems, for all the key components of what the United States needs for our economy, for our military, and all of our partners. But can you discuss the dire situation that 80-90% of those chips are made in a country, or if you call it a country, China doesn't like it to be called a country, but let's call it Taiwan, which is only 100 miles offshore from your global competitor. And I suppose what does that show about kind of where we are in terms of the difficulty of really decoupling, say, from China and the rest of the world, and more importantly, what does that continuing threat of China to Taiwan look like?
So most of the semiconductors that the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy and most of the world economy rely on are made by one company, TSMC in Taiwan, which, as Ronan said, is on precisely the island that China would like to have reunified with it, including by force if necessary. If you tried to buy a car during COVID and couldn't, it was because there weren't enough semiconductors out there. There were enough tires, or enough wheels, there was enough steel, but there weren't enough microchips. And so, we have in our heads how acutely sensitive the U.S. economy and the world economy can become to, for example, the price of oil or something like that. Well, it's arguably even more sensitive to the supply of microchips. And again, so you have a disproportionate number of these made at TSMC in Taiwan. This obviously causes some concern when your major source of supply is at a potentially geopolitically, if not militarily, vulnerable position. TSMC is building a plant in Arizona, and there's efforts to try to diversify production and supply. But one, semiconductor fabs are very expensive to build. Two, you got to have the engineers actually do it. There's all these challenges. And then even when Arizona's fab gets really scaled up, it's only going to be a fraction of TSMC's output. And by the way, TSMC supplies both the United States and China. Some people have referred to this as Taiwan's silicon shield. That's sort of the top reason why the United States would actually want to defend Taiwan if China attacked, because we wouldn't want China to get a hold of the world's biggest semiconductor manufacturer, given that we are so reliant on it. So all of these factors are going into how people think about Taiwan in particular, but also technology diversification. That's a little bit different from this question of decoupling between the U.S. and Chinese economies, because again, that's Taiwan, but you're seeing some decoupling on the technology side. You're certainly seeing a diminution of investment into China from the United States, and you're seeing greater restrictions on Chinese investment here and things like that. But I mean, still, the level of trade between the United States and China is extraordinarily high. And you could bifurcate all that, you could cut it all off, but the cost to us, the economic cost, would be very, very high.
And looking at Taiwan, they have a major election here in the next few days. Can you talk about having to choose within Taiwan itself? It's a long history, especially basically since 1949. Of knowing China is next door, knowing China is a huge, massive potential threat, but trying to walk that line of being open and working with the West, but also having reasonable relations with China. How does that play out in the upcoming election we have? And I suppose with the kind of increasingly overt kind of claims, or I don't want to say threats from President Xi with regards to China retaking or kind of reclaiming Taiwan, where are the Taiwanese people feeling if they're going to have to make a decision, choosing China or the West?
So the Chinese position on Taiwan, it's always been, it's part of China and we will reunify at some point. But it shifted pretty dramatically from Deng Xiaoping, who used to say, well, if it takes 100 years to reunify, that's fine. We got other things to do, to Xi Jinping, who says, we won't wait forever for reunification, and that the Chinese people are running out of patience, and that the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation requires reunification with Taiwan. And the unspoken part of that is even if the people in Taiwan don't want it, which they don't. I mean, if you are living in Taiwan, which is a prosperous democracy, and you look at what has happened to Hong Kong under this sort of one country, two systems, which turned out at the end to be one country, one system, there's no way you want that. And also the Taiwanese identity has become stronger and stronger over the years. So the election's happening. If there's some chance, I guess, that the KMT, the Kuomintang candidate, will win, and there will be some kind of relaxation of tension with China, the way there was under President Ma some years ago. But it looks more likely that the DPP candidate, William Lai, will win. He's been, how would you describe, maybe independence curious over the years. So he's never really come out and said, we need to declare independence, but he's been more forward-leaning rhetorically than Tsai Ing-wen, the current president. And on the campaign trail, he's adopted her language and things like that. But the Chinese, I think, are a little freaked out that he will come in and start being, independence flirtatious. I actually think that that's unlikely. But it's all taking place against a backdrop of Xi Jinping has told the People's Liberation Army to be ready and prepared for a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan by 2027. So that's what they're preparing for. That doesn't mean they will do it, but that's the aim, is to be capable of that. So, the stakes are pretty high. And then, of course, on our side, it used to be the case where presidents were ambiguous about whether we would defend Taiwan if attacked. So one time, George W. Bush publicly said, yes, I would do that, and then he kind of backed off pretty quickly, never said it again. Joe Biden 4 times now has said publicly, if Taiwan is attacked, the United States will come to its aid and defend it. So you put all of this together.
And you also would preface either Secretary Blinken or Jake Sullivan, someone would kind of come in afterwards, kind of soften or clean up what had been said, say this was not exactly what he meant or whatever. But do you think that's a true slip-up by Biden to say that so definitively? Because, for the audience to know that the traditional, for the last few decades, position in the U.S. has been kind of strategic ambiguity. Right. We will never definitively say we will defend Taiwan. We'll never definitively say that we won't. Right. Do you think Biden's just making a mistake, or he's consciously made a decision that he'd be willing to do that?
Well, the way I see it is, in Washington, a Washington gaffe is when a politician screws up and says what they really believe. And I think that's what the president did. Okay. 4 times he was asked, would you defend Taiwan if it's attacked by China? He said, yeah. Now, the policy is strategic ambiguity, and then people come out after and say, well, it's still strategic ambiguity, and what he said is totally consistent with the policy of ambiguity, and they're like, phew. And then he does it again. But at the end of the day, he would be the decider, not the people working for him. So I think you have to take the president as word that if, God forbid, we got ourselves into that situation, that is how he would react.
And looking, like you mentioned, God forbid, something would happen there. A Chinese attack and invasion of Taiwan would make Russia's invasion of Ukraine look like a picnic in terms of complications and difficulty. It's a small island. It's thousands of miles away from us, hard to defend. It's right off the coast of China. Ukraine is a huge country, strategic depth. It's got 5 NATO ally borders to bring weapons and supplies in and out of. In terms of amplifying to the Chinese the potential danger of creating a war, starting a war. Can you talk about the Quad? People may have heard about it, may not know much what it is, and maybe how it really is a long way from being anything close to NATO, but maybe it's a start in terms of strengthening the balance against China.
Yeah, and of course the biggest difference between the war in Ukraine and a potential war over Taiwan is the United States is not party to the war in Ukraine. I mean, we're obviously providing very large amounts of military equipment and advice, but Americans aren't fighting Russians. But there's a very good chance that if there's a war in Taiwan, Americans would be fighting Chinese, and then you have an escalatory potential that could make you stay up pretty late at night worrying about. So there's a very strong set of reasons to try to deter conflict in the first place if we can do so and to avoid it. The Quad is this group of 4 countries, United States, Australia, India, and Japan. It originally started during the George W. Bush administration as basically a way to to coordinate responses to the tsunami that took place, humanitarian stuff and all of that. And then it kind of grew in ambition. It became a kind of a convenient coordination function. And then it sort of went into abeyance because the Australians kind of got cold feet. But then it came kind of roaring back, and in the Biden administration now they have annual Quad meetings that are summits, meeting at the leader level. The four announced a major COVID vaccine initiative, 1 billion vaccines for Southeast Asia. They're talking more and more about, security issues. So far, it's mostly talking about security issues. I mean, these four countries are not allied to each other. The U.S. is allied to, to two of them, and India is allied to none of them. So it's complicated, but there is a Quad, and it is emblematic of what I was saying at the very beginning. The more the American policymakers got concerned about China's rise, and the less they sort of believed that China would be transformed, the more they wanted to hedge. They wanted to build these relationships with other countries so as to balance Chinese power, and that's exactly what other countries in the region are doing, including the three that are in the Quad. And
then looking at kind of the world choosing or taking sides in the other huge tragic headline of the last 2 years, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What lessons do you think can be learned from that with regards to much of the developing world, especially outside of Europe, and our U.S. allies in South Korea and Japan, whatnot, have been on the fence or not done much at all? With regards to China, obviously supportive of Russia, but do you think maybe it's promising that so far they have not provided large levels of weaponry, especially after the administration called it out last year? What does the war show you about this idea that countries are having to choose, or are they choosing?
I think that was like 4 questions.
I'm sorry.
So I'm going to try. All right. I'll try to.
But basically, what lessons would you think we should take from the war? And
one is a little bit. I think actually it's come of something of a surprise. One was how fast the big G7 type of countries sort of rallied to the cause. So almost overnight, you had all of Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, all join in sanctions against Russia, aid for Ukraine. I mean, that's a majority of the world's economy. It's a huge amount of military power and so on. But then there's the rest of the world. And so people have often said, well, China's role is to be expected, or its position anyway. India is something of a surprise because we would have liked India to condemn Russia's invasion and to aid the Ukrainians if they could. They've done neither of those things really. And in fact, the Indian foreign minister just made a big triumphant visit to Moscow a couple days ago. But look at our own hemisphere. I mean, other than Canada, we don't have really anybody in this hemisphere who shares our position. Mexico hasn't sanctioned Russia, or so. In the sort of what they often call the rest of the world, the countries do not share our position for a variety of reasons, but one of them is, they look and say, well, why is it that you care so much about this conflict in Europe and you didn't care about, conflict in my backyard here, conflict in my backyard there? There's also more hard-headed interests at stake for some of them. I mean, India, for example, gets the majority of its military equipment, including maintenance and other things, from Russia, has an interest in preserving that relationship and so forth by buying, lower priced oil and things like that. So one of the lessons is, just because you have sort of the big countries, the big wealthy countries that are like-minded, doesn't mean that you've sort of won the debates everywhere else, or that other countries see that. The other, I guess, is probably more pragmatic, but if you look at from a military perspective, the vast majority of military equipment that Ukraine got has gone to Ukraine after the fighting started. If you transpose this situation in Taiwan, on the day the fighting starts, it's going to have what it's going to have. There is no Poland adjacent to Taiwan through which the Allies can flow military equipment in. So anything that you think the Taiwanese should have, they need to have before the shooting starts, not after. So that's been another. And there's there's other lessons too. And
you mentioned it. A lot of people would give I suppose would give kind of critical remarks, even going back to George Bush, 43, with regards to after Putin's invasion of Georgia, relatively light response to that. Obama, Putin annexes Crimea, he foments a civil war in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, again, relatively weak response. Trump, not the same level of actions don't occur, but not much is happening then. People will give Biden a lot of credit for coming out ahead of the war, the full-scale invasion, and saying this is really going to happen, this is our intelligence. But a lot of people, especially the military, their biggest criticism is this incrementalism, this everything the Ukrainians need and ask for, they either have to wait 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year to get it, which maybe they would have held on to more of their territory. Less Ukrainians would have been killed. Do you think we've learned that lesson? And with regards to Taiwan, it's this idea that it's the porcupine approach, that we will actually give Taiwan everything it needs to defend itself and be able to fight?
Yeah, so I think the criticism on the pacing of the supply of weapon systems to Ukraine is pretty valid. Now, in defense of the folks in the administration trying to make these decisions, they're trying to, on the one hand, give Ukraine as much sort of firepower as possible to defend itself effectively without provoking some escalation that would be potentially catastrophic from Russia. That's an art more than a science. There's not a menu that says, well, if I give them this, then he'll do that, and if I give him that, he won't do this and stuff. So they were trying to kind of feel their way through that. That said, they did have this pattern of saying whatever the weapon system was, tanks, cluster munitions, HIMARS, you can pick what it is. They said, no, you can't have it. No, you can't have it. No, you can't have it. Okay, you can have it. And so what this has done is sort of dribbled out some of these systems over a long period of time. And then once you got into 2023, the Russians have really dug in on this 700-mile line that runs north to south in eastern Ukraine, have entrenched fortifications and minefields and, much more effective electronic warfare than they did toward the beginning of the war. And so a lot of these systems, once they finally arrived, were not as effective as they might have been earlier in the war. But, it's hard to say. I do give the administration a lot of credit for organizing all of this in the first place, and I think they've taken some extraordinary steps to put together this coalition of countries that are aiding Ukraine and that are sort of stuck in there at pretty high cost. With Taiwan, again, it would be different because everything would turn on whether the U.S. would enter the war if there was one. I think maybe the escalation sort of thing is more on the political side there, because part of strategic ambiguity is one for the Chinese to think, well, the U.S. might defend Taiwan if we attack, so maybe we don't want to in the first place. But also for the Taiwanese to think, well, the Americans might not defend us if China attacks, so let's not do something politically provocative enough that'll elicit an attack in the first place, like some declaration of independence, or if you go back to Chen Shui-bian days, when they were talking about having a referendum on independence or something like that. So those are the kinds of things, but it's on the political side there that I think is probably the analog on the Taiwanese side. But the Taiwanese, I think, are not anywhere near any of that kind of overtly provocative stuff because they see what that might elicit as well.
But have we learned the Ukrainian lesson, and are we planning to supply the Taiwanese with the highest and best level weapon systems that they will need? Because there's no way who's president 4, 6, 8 years from now. The Taiwanese have no idea whether or not the U.S. will be there to support them. Yeah. But if they have to fight themselves, they need more than what they have now. Are we doing that?
So you said, are we planning to do it? The answer is yes. Are we doing it? The answer is no. Okay. So, and one of the big constraints is the production levels in the defense industrial base. We do not have the manufacturing base. And actually, the Europeans don't and the Japanese don't, that existed around, World War II, where you could turn factories into, making weapons if you want. And now there's very high demand for a number of weapon systems. So if you want missile defense, then those missile defense systems come off the line, at a regular pace. But the Ukrainians want them, the Israelis want them, the Gulf Arab states want them because they're worried about Iran. The Taiwanese are going to want them, and we want them. So what do, right? You can't produce enough for everybody, and so there's some initial steps. I think on the defense industrial base side, that was a major wake-up call. No one thought we would be in a position where one of the biggest problems was, you couldn't make enough mortars and bullets in enough time to be able to supply a country fighting for its life. But that is essentially the situation that we have found ourselves in. I was last year at the Munich Security Conference, and the German defense minister was there talking a little bit about this, and he said, asking a rhetorical question, he said, how do we get ourselves into a situation where the entire European Union combined can't produce enough ammunition as fast as the Ukrainians are expending it? He said, there's a simple answer. We never thought we'd be in this situation before. We never thought the state-on-state land war in Europe with tanks and mortars and trenches and hundreds of thousands of casualties. We didn't think that was a thing anymore. We thought we were talking about high-end, technologically sophisticated war, maybe in Asia, or, the more basic stuff in the Middle East. This has come to something to surprise. So there's some work being done, but it takes
time and probably and more work to be done, I guess.
Oh yeah.
Two related great questions from the audience about Taiwan. One from Bethany, one of our great students from the Audi International School, and another from Richard.
Good name.
Yeah, very good name. Bethany asks, if the U.S. has to defend Taiwan, would it stretch the U.S.'s resources, and would it be difficult, basically, if we potentially were involved in a war in Ukraine and Taiwan? You kind of touched upon some of it, but you want to kind of expand upon it. And then Richard asks, how would an invasion of Taiwan and a potential U.S. counteroffensive play out, militarily, politically, economically?
If there was a U.S.-China war over Taiwan, it would stretch our resources even if there wasn't a war in Ukraine. This is the thing to sort of understand. Sometimes, even in Washington, people talk about U.S.-China war over Taiwan with a certain casualness, as if, maybe it'd be a skirmish in the Western Pacific and it'd last a couple of weeks or something like that. Well, maybe, but highly unlikely. And much more likely, because, I've played in many of these war games and things like that. The hardest thing is to figure out when one side would say, no mas, I'm not, we've lost, we're going home, we're not going to fight anymore. And the incentives to continue, if you're America or if you're China, are tremendous, and the resource base you have to throw at this is tremendous. So you could see destruction on the level that we haven't seen since the Second World War. It could be truly catastrophic levels of violence. So again, there's a very high set of interests that we should all have in avoiding that kind of war in the first place. The second question, I guess, follows directly from that. What would be kind of the outcome if that actually happened? Well, certainly on the military side, you would see, tens of thousands of American casualties probably. You would see, potentially destruction of huge numbers of military assets and American bases in different countries around the world. But economically, again, China's one of our top trade partners. I think that would disappear overnight, no matter what the cost is. You got your 403B and 401k in the stock market. Well, that thing is not going up when all of this stuff happens. So, the economic consequences would be absolutely profound. And then you have sort of the sustainment of all of this, right? So where does it go once it starts? Hard to say. So yes, fighting China would not be like fighting Saddam Hussein or the Taliban or ISIS or Milosevic back in the 90s or even Gaddafi.
Or even Putin.
Yeah, or any of this. You would be talking about something that is categorically different than we have seen in our lifetimes. Can we get on to something rosier?
That's a little hard.
Anybody have a question about opportunity?
This is kind of, at least ideologically, something to consider. David asks, don't you think the efficiency of a communist government combined with the effectiveness of a capitalist economy gives China a distinct advantage going forward in the 21st century? And maybe just more broadly, if you could discuss this idea and challenge of China saying to the developing world, the U.S. model, the West democratic model, that's difficult, that's messy, elections are pain, what's happening. Our model works a lot better. Can you talk about the Chinese model and how effective it is, and maybe its role in kind of being a potential, it's the new communism, it's not communism,
right,
of the world going forward.
Right, so this is the Chinese claim, which is, we've sort of over the years, they wobbled their way toward this economic system that has a pretty significant degree of statism, state-owned enterprises and state capital controls and all this other stuff, but that has got a pretty healthy dose of capitalism as well, private enterprise and all this, and that this has been economically very successful. They had double-digit growth for 30 years, and now their growth is down at 5% or something like that, but it's still higher than most countries. They have a declining population, so per capita income is rising, all of that. And they couple that with what they will say is a very effective form of autocracy. They also now label that, they don't call it autocracy, they call it Chinese democracy. They just say it's democracy with Chinese characteristics, and no one has a monopoly on defining democracy, so whereas we say democracy means you get to choose your leaders, So they make a claim that theirs is just a different version of democracy. But there's a major problem with autocracy, including the kind of autocracy that China has, which is that at some level, you're governed by a random number generator. There's one guy in charge, and if he makes a good decision, fine, and if he doesn't, that's not fine, and there's not anything you can do about it. So in a country like ours, we've got our issues, but policymakers are accountable to the law and to Congress and to the American people, who can change a government every 4 years if they want, and they campaign for things. And I would much rather have our problems than China's problems. So yes, they have said, well, look, America's fractured and divided and inefficient, and we can build a hospital in a week. Well, it's also the same country that COVID started, and they covered it up because of what would have been national embarrassment, and is now repressing key elements of their economy and seem not to be able to do otherwise because it conflicts with the primacy of the party. And then you just have kind of the basic situation where I just spoke with someone earlier today who just got back off the plane from China and said there's a climate of fear in a lot of places in that country. So is it efficient? Well, yeah, it's efficient surveillance, it's efficient building, it's efficient on a lot of things, but there's more that one would want out of life than just what the Chinese autocratic system can deliver.
And in line with that discussion, Michael asks, what are your thoughts about some people's concerns or perceptions that a new axis is forming of countries opposed to U.S./Western interests led by China with Russia, Iran, and others? Just see if you extrapolate on that a little bit more. Basically, this idea that maybe democracy and a liberal kind of world order has lost its shine, or at least for a lot of the world. You think it's as dire as people say? Should we be doing more, or it's maybe something that's a little more overly blown up than should be?
Well, there is an axis that is forming. That is actually working together now, and you can see it in very concrete terms. The 4 key countries in it are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And again, very concrete terms. So North Korea is providing, missiles and ammunition and things to Russia to be able to better shoot at Ukrainians. Iran is providing drones, to Russia. Both of those countries will get something in return, probably some sort of missile technology for North Korea and maybe for Iran, but other things besides. The Chinese have not provided weapon systems in the same way, but they provided components and other things, and certainly have diplomatically protected the Russians to the greatest degree possible. Iran and China have what they refer to as a comprehensive strategic partnership. You can sort of trace this around. And the degree to which these countries are working together is higher than it was even a couple of years ago. And their collective degree of discontent with the way things are is greater than it was even a few years ago. So the glue that holds them together is their sense that the world is ordered unfairly and dominated by the West, with the United States at top. And that's kind of a legacy of the way things used to be, but doesn't reflect power balances the way things should be now. And that these countries are constrained and don't have sort of their rightful state in the world. So for Iran, that means a dominant role in the Middle East. In Russia, it means near abroad in a sphere of influence and so forth. You sort of go around. And so that really is something that sort of brings them together in common cause. Then you have other sort of strap hangers like Venezuela and Cuba and some of these other, Nicaragua and some of these other countries on a good day for them. It would be great if you had that on one side, and on the other side, you had vibrant, well-functioning democracies that were possessed by a spirit of political unity around key values and ideals, even if there were differences over policy and particular politics. Of course, we don't have anything like that, right? I mean, like, we're at each other's throats most of the day. When we can get our act together, we'll, decide to do something else. And so, yes, if we were a more functioning set of democracies, then we would be better able to deal with that axis. I still think that we can, but the degree to which Americans and other democracies are internally cohesive, then the better able they will be to contest this axis is forming.
And just for sake of time, just a quick follow-up on that, and then a last question from the audience. Of the quad from the other side, you mentioned Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. The relationship between Russia and China obviously is the one of most interest for much of the world, for the United States, for all of our allies. Can you discuss how you see that? It is one historically that has ebbed and flowed, and it obviously has completely changed. It used to be Stalin was the big brother, and Mao was was viewed as the little brother. Obviously, those roles have completely reversed. President Xi in China, they obviously despise and hate a lot of what the Kim regime does in North Korea, but they don't want a Western puppet in there. They don't want South Korea Part 2 in North Korea. They don't want regime change for that. They don't want millions of North Korean refugees flowing in there. Similarly, with regards to Putin, probably his decision to invade Ukraine, or more fully invade Ukraine, created a huge headache for them, which they're not happy about. But at the same time, if it's either Putin or they end up with some government eventually that was aligned with the West, that's not good for us. How do you see the Chinese-Russian relationship, and maybe more importantly, China's level of commitment to Russia?
So before the Russians invaded Ukraine, this was in 2022, right? So if you go back to the previous fall, the U.S. got its hands on the Russian war plan, and after saying, seriously? They had to try to figure out what to do about it, and they did a couple of things, including sending emissaries over to Moscow to try to talk some sense into the Russians, including with Putin himself via video conference, though. The Russians essentially didn't deny that they were planning to invade Ukraine, and were also unmovable. So the administration said, well, maybe the Chinese can talk some sense into them. So they showed what they had to the Chinese and said, here's the thing, and can you go talk to the Russians and say, this is about to be a very catastrophic mistake. You're about to elicit horrible things. Don't do this. The Chinese then went to the Russians, and not only did they not say don't do this, they said the Americans are trying to get us to tell you not to do this, and we're not taking their bait. Because what the Russian message to the Chinese is, if the West wins in Ukraine, Moscow's going to be next, and guess who's after that? They're going to just keep on the march. They're going to foment these color revolutions, their democracy, they're going to try to overthrow our government, they're going to come after you when they can. So stop them in Ukraine, and they'll never get to Beijing, is basically the kind of message. The Chinese, before the Russian invasion, thought a couple of things. One, it wasn't clear that the Chinese understood that when the Russians were going to invade, they were going to go to Kiev, try to topple the government, put in a puppet, as opposed to just invade more in the east. That's one. And two, they thought the Russians would be good at this. Mm-hmm. And that was their big surprise. It's one thing to be evil. It's another to be evil and incompetent. And it turned out that, at least from a European perspective, my perspective as well, but what the Russians did was, both evil and incompetent. They didn't win the war in 2 weeks and march in victory, and everybody had to get used to it. We're still seeing this horrible conflict take place. And so the Chinese started to worry, well, our buddies, the Russians, have got themselves in a quagmire, and guess who blames us? The Europeans, the same Europeans that we have this big economic relationship with, and we don't want allied with the Americans against us. So that's what the Chinese Chinese have really kind of worried about. But at the end of the day, this glue that I was talking about that holds these 4 countries together is stronger than any of those other concerns. So they're sticking with the Russians come hell or high water, and that's just going to be what they do.
Okay, and the last question from the audience, and also just kind of maybe kind of a overall regards or remarks. Alan asks, how has the downturn in the Chinese economy altered China's plans? And maybe just kind of in relation to that, the thought was an increase in advancing the Chinese economy will kind of help lead to a softening communism, maybe not democracy, but a little more opening. Do you think there's any chance of the reverse, that actually an economic downturn or large unemployment in China, especially the youth, will lead to more demands from the street, people on the streets, and maybe you get change that way, or that's unlikely?
It's very hard to see, an uprising or a popular, a color revolution or a Tiananmen sort of thing that leads to a change in government. I suppose you never say never, but it's very difficult to see that happen. For one reason, just because the Chinese security state is so incredibly effective now. I mean, their surveillance is just sort of off the charts, and their willingness to use repression is high, and all of this. So I wouldn't bet on that. That said, the economic downturn is clearly changing at least some elements of their plans. I mean, if you look now, youth unemployment in China, depending on whose numbers you believe, is somewhere between 25 and 40%, pretty high. You have a lot of people graduating from college, no job prospects. They call this laying down generation. People want to go home. They're all only children because they've had the one-child policy for so long. So they go home and just live with their parents, don't get a job. The real estate sector, complete overbuilding of real estate, housing stock and apartments and things like that are unoccupied. In turn, you then have this big stock of non-performing loans on bank balance sheets and things like that. The growth rate has come from, it used to be above 10%. Now it's probably between 4 or 5 or something like that. So you can, point out all this. So when Xi Jinping came to San Francisco a couple of months ago for the APEC summit, one of his big sort of messages was China is open for business. COVID is over, China's open for business. And the subtle thing was, and don't keep throwing all these sanctions and export controls and investment reviews and all this other stuff that's sort of throwing sand into the gears of what otherwise would be a beneficial economic relationship between China and the rest of the world. What it does not seem to have changed is its sort of geopolitical aspirations or its military activities. I mean, the defense budget continues to go up like that. I mean, China, China has a bigger navy than the United States does now. China, you start to count the things it has. It's pretty extraordinary. Its modernization plans, or its sort of diplomatic activity. It convened the so-called BRICS countries, last year, and is trying to these alternatives to Western configuration, trying to bring countries together in that and be more active there. So I guess the way I would put it is, from a foreign policy standpoint, the stuff that we care about most, which is their military capability, their diplomatic activity, their sort of plans with other countries around the world, I don't really see any change. Over time, will you? Who knows? But I guess I'll have to come back.
Because it is we'll have to end it there. It's a hard topic to end on something positive and light and easy. But I want to thank you all again for coming. Great to see you again for the new year, and hope you'll join us again soon. Next week we have the Wall Street Journal's chief foreign affairs correspondent, Yaroslav Trofimov. He'll be excellent soon. And as Marianne mentioned, we have New York Times' David Brooks on February 12th. We have two-time Pulitzer Prize winner Stephen Call on February 29th, talking about openly and honestly about where the U.S. has made mistakes in the Middle East, especially with regards to our relationship with Iraq and Saddam Hussein over the last 30, 40 years. So that should be fascinating. And will you all please join me in welcoming our great friend of the council and one of our favorite speakers, Richard Fontaine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.